Right now, as you watch this video, something extraordinary is happening inside your skull. Approximately 86 billion neurons are firing in coordinated patterns. Electrochemical signals are racing along axons at speeds up to 120 meters per second. Neurotransmitters are flooding across synaptic clefts. Glutamate, GABA, dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine. Billions of molecular transactions per second. Your visual cortex is processing the photons hitting your retina. Your auditory cortex is processing the sound waves entering your ears. Your prefrontal cortex is evaluating the meaning of what you are seeing and hearing. Your hippocampus is encoding the experience into memory. Your default mode network is maintaining your sense of being a self who is having this experience. All of this is neuroscience. All of this is measurable. All of this is well understood. We can see it on an fMRI. We can measure it with an EEG. We can map which neurons fire when you see the color red, or hear a C major chord, or feel pain in your left hand. We can predict from brain scans which image you are looking at before you report it. We can stimulate specific brain regions with electrodes and produce specific experiences. Stimulate the fusiform face area and you see faces. Stimulate the temporal lobe and you feel a sense of presence. Stimulate the motor cortex and your hand moves without your willing it. But here is the thing that should keep you awake at night. After 150 years of modern neuroscience, after functional MRI and PET scans and optogenetics and single neuron recording and computational models of neural networks, and the complete mapping of every neuron and every synapse in the brain of C. elegans, after all of it, we cannot answer the simplest question a child could ask. Why does any of this feel like anything? Why does the electrochemical activity in your visual cortex not just process information about wavelengths but produce the experience of redness? Why does the neural activity in your auditory cortex not just analyze sound frequencies but generate the experience of hearing music? Why does the firing of C fibers not just send a damage signal to the brain but create the experience of pain? Why is there an inside to your brain activity? Why is there something it is like to be you? A computer processes information. A thermostat processes information. Your phone processes information. None of them experience anything. There is nothing it is like to be a thermostat. The thermostat registers temperature. It activates the heating system. It processes information about the environment and responds appropriately. But the thermostat does not feel warm. The thermostat does not experience anything. The thermostat is processing in the dark. No inner light. No subjective experience. No awareness. Your brain also processes information, but your brain does something the thermostat does not. Your brain produces experience. Inner experience. Subjective experience. The felt quality of seeing blue. The felt quality of tasting chocolate, the felt quality of being in love, the felt quality of existing, of being someone, of having an inside. How? How does meat think? How does electrochemistry become experience? How does the objective physical process of neurons firing produce the subjective experience of consciousness? This is the hard problem of consciousness. Named by David Chalmers in 1994, at a conference in Tucson, Arizona, published in his 1995 paper, Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness, in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. And it has become the most important unsolved problem in science. Not one of the most important, the most important. Because every other scientific problem exists within the framework of a conscious observer trying to understand the world. The hard problem asks where the observer itself comes from, what the observer is, how the observer exists at all. Chalmers made a distinction that clarified everything. He separated the easy problems of consciousness from the hard problem. The easy problems are not easy in the ordinary sense. They are extraordinarily difficult scientific challenges that have occupied thousands of researchers for decades. But they are easy in the sense that we know what kind of answer would solve them. We know the methodology, we know the framework, we know what success looks like. The easy problems include the ability to discriminate among stimuli and respond appropriately, the ability to integrate information from different sensory modalities, the ability to report on internal states, the ability to focus attention, the ability to control behavior, the difference between waking and sleeping. These are all problems about the functions of consciousness, about what consciousness does, about the mechanisms that enable conscious behavior. For every easy problem, we can imagine a neural mechanism that would solve it. We can imagine a neural circuit that discriminates stimuli, a neural circuit that integrates information, a neural circuit that generates verbal reports about internal states, a neural circuit that directs attention. We can build computational models of these circuits. We can test them against brain data. We can make progress. We have made progress, enormous progress. The neuroscience of the last 50 years has been spectacularly successful at solving the easy problems. The hard problem is different. The hard problem is not about what consciousness does. It is about what consciousness is. Not about function, but about experience. Not about the mechanisms of behavior, but about the felt quality of inner life. Why is there experience at all? Why does information processing in the brain not happen in the dark, the way it happens in a computer? Why is there a subjective dimension? Why does it feel like something to be a brain? This is the question that no neural mechanism can answer. You can describe every neuron, every synapse, every neurotransmitter, every ion channel, every molecular interaction. You can build a complete circuit diagram of the entire human brain, all 86 billion neurons, all 100 trillion synapses, every connection mapped, every signal traced, and you will have explained everything about how the brain processes information. And you will have explained nothing about why that information processing is accompanied by subjective experience. The explanatory gap between the objective description and the subjective reality remains. No amount of neural detail closes it, because the gap is not about missing details. The gap is about the difference between two kinds of thing: objective physical processes and subjective experience. And no accumulation of information about the first kind automatically tells you anything about the second kind. Let me make this concrete with qualia. Qualia are the subjective qualities of conscious experience: the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the sweetness of sugar, the sound of a violin, the smell of coffee, the warmth of sunlight on your skin. These are not abstract philosophical concepts. They are the most intimate facts of your existence. They are what your life actually consists of when you strip away the theories and the explanations and the third-person descriptions. Your life is qualia. Every moment of every day is a flow of subjective experience. Right now, as you read this, you are experiencing qualia. The visual qualia of the shapes and colors on your screen, the tactile qualia of whatever your body is touching, the ambient qualia of the sounds around you, the proprioceptive qualia of your body's position in space, the emotional qualia of whatever you are feeling: curiosity, boredom, excitement, skepticism. These experiences are real. They are the most real thing you know. More real than any scientific theory, because every scientific theory is experienced through qualia. You read the theory, you see the equation, you hear the explanation. Every piece of knowledge you have ever acquired arrived through the medium of conscious experience. Qualia are not decorations on top of information processing. Qualia are the medium through which all information is received, the screen through which all reality is viewed, the ground on which all knowledge stands. The inverted spectrum thought experiment makes the strangeness vivid. Imagine that what you see when you look at a red fire truck is the same experience I have when I look at green grass. And what you see when you look at green grass is the same experience I have when I look at a red fire truck. Our color experiences are systematically inverted, but we both call fire trucks red and grass green because we learned the words from the same objects. We both stop at red traffic lights and go at green ones. Our behavior is identical. Our neural processing might even be identical in structural terms, but our inner experience is different, completely different. You see my green when you look at red objects. I see your red when I look at green objects. Here is the disturbing question. How would we ever know? If our behavior is the same and our verbal reports are the same and our neural structures are the same, then no external measurement, no brain scan, no behavioral test could detect the inversion. The subjective experience is invisible to every objective measurement, not because the measurement is imprecise, because subjective experience and objective measurement are different kinds of thing. The measurement lives in the third-person world of publicly observable data. The experience lives in the first-person world of privately felt reality, and no bridge has been built between them. Not by neuroscience, not by philosophy, not by 150 years of trying. And qualia are invisible to neuroscience, not because neuroscience is inadequate in its methodology, because neuroscience measures objective physical events, neural firing rates, blood oxygen levels, electrical field potentials, neurotransmitter concentrations, synaptic weights, connectivity patterns. These are objective measurements of objective processes. Qualia are subjective experiences of a subjective reality. The redness of red is not a wavelength. 700 nanometers is a wavelength. Redness is what it is like to experience 700 nanometers hitting your retina and being processed by your visual cortex. The measurement and the experience are categorically different things. They belong to different ontological kingdoms. No measurement of neural activity, no matter how precise, no matter how complete, will ever tell you what red looks like from the inside. Because measurements are third-person descriptions of public phenomena. Experience is first-person acquaintance with private phenomena, and third-person data does not contain first-person facts. Not because the data is incomplete, because the data is the wrong kind of thing to contain what we are looking for. You cannot find the taste of chocolate by analyzing cocoa chemistry more precisely. The chemistry and the taste are related, but they are not the same thing. And knowing everything about one does not give you the other. Frank Jackson made this vivid with his famous thought experiment in 1982, Mary's Room. Imagine Mary is a brilliant neuroscientist who has lived her entire life in a black and white room. She has never seen color, but she has studied everything there is to know about the neuroscience of color vision. She knows which wavelengths activate which cone cells. She knows the neural pathways from retina to lateral geniculate nucleus to primary visual cortex to V4, the color processing area. She knows every molecular mechanism of color perception. She knows everything physical there is to know about what happens when someone sees red. Now Mary leaves the room and sees a red rose for the first time. Does she learn something new? If you answer yes, then there is something about conscious experience that is not captured by the complete physical description. There is a fact about what red looks like that cannot be derived from knowing everything about the physics and neuroscience of color. There is something over and above the physical facts, something that can only be known through experience. This is the knowledge argument against physicalism, and it is devastating. If you answer no, then you are claiming that Mary already knew what red looks like despite never having seen it. That complete knowledge of wavelengths and neural pathways and neurotransmitter cascades gives you the knowledge of what redness feels like from the inside. And I think you know that is absurd. You could memorize every neuroscience textbook ever written about pain. You would not know what pain feels like until you felt it. The experience adds something that the description does not contain. The zombie argument makes the same point from the opposite direction, conceived by Chalmers and refined by multiple philosophers. Imagine a being physically identical to you in every respect. Every atom in the same place, every neuron firing the same way, every behavior identical. This being walks and talks and laughs and cries exactly as you do. It says, "I am conscious." It reports experiences. It behaves in every way as if it has inner experience. But it does not. There is no one home, no inner light, no subjective experience, no qualia. It is a philosophical zombie. The question is whether a zombie is logically possible, not physically possible, logically possible. Can you conceive of it without contradiction? Most people can. You can imagine a being that behaves exactly like a conscious person, but has no inner experience. This conceivability does not prove that zombies exist, but it proves something important. It proves that consciousness is not logically entailed by the physical description. If it were, then a zombie would be inconceivable. A square circle is inconceivable because circularity contradicts squareness. But a zombie is conceivable because nothing in the physical description of a system logically requires that the system have subjective experience. The physical description tells you what the system does. It does not tell you what the system experiences. These are different questions, and different questions can have independent answers. Now, you might think this is just philosophy, just word games, just thought experiments, disconnected from real science. You would be wrong. The hard problem has concrete consequences for neuroscience. It determines what counts as an explanation of consciousness, and it reveals that neuroscience, despite its extraordinary successes, has not explained consciousness at all. It has explained the correlates of consciousness, the mechanisms of consciousness, the functions of consciousness. But it has not explained consciousness itself, the subjective experience, the inner light, the felt quality, the thing that makes consciousness rather than just information processing. Consider the most advanced neuroscience of consciousness available today. There are 4 major scientific theories competing for the title of the theory of consciousness. Each is sophisticated. Each makes testable predictions. Each has serious empirical support, and none of them solves the hard problem. Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory at the University of Wisconsin is perhaps the most mathematically rigorous. Tononi begins with 5 axioms about the essential properties of conscious experience. Consciousness exists intrinsically. It is structured. It is specific. Each experience is particular. It is unified, cannot be divided into independent parts, and it is definite, has specific boundaries. From these axioms, Tononi derives a mathematical quantity called phi that measures the amount of integrated information in a system. Any system with phi greater than 0 has some degree of consciousness according to IIT. A thermostat has a tiny phi. A worm has more. A sleeping brain has less than a waking brain. A human brain during peak conscious experience has enormously high phi. The theory is elegant. It is precise. It makes specific predictions about which systems are conscious and which are not. It can in principle be tested, but does IIT solve the hard problem? It says consciousness is identical with integrated information. It identifies a mathematical structure phi and declares that this structure is consciousness. But why? Why does integrated information feel like something? Why does phi greater than 0 produce subjective experience? Why does information that is integrated feel different from information that is not integrated? IIT defines a mathematical correlate and identifies it with consciousness by axiom. It does not explain the identification. It does not bridge the gap between the objective measurement of phi and the subjective reality of what it is like to have that particular phi value. The hard problem peers through the mathematical formalism untouched. Consider global workspace theory, developed by Bernard Baars and refined by Stanislas Dehaene. The theory proposes that consciousness arises when information is broadcast globally across the brain through a network of long-range connections. Unconscious processing is local. Conscious processing is global. When information enters the global workspace, it becomes available to multiple cognitive systems simultaneously: memory, language, decision-making, motor planning. This global availability is consciousness. It is a powerful theory. It explains many features of conscious processing. It predicts specific neural signatures that have been confirmed experimentally. The P3B wave, the late sustained negativity, the ignition of frontoparietal networks during conscious perception. But does it solve the hard problem? It explains which information becomes conscious and which remains unconscious. It explains the mechanism of global broadcast. It does not explain why global broadcast feels like something, why information that is broadcast globally is accompanied by subjective experience, while information that remains local is not. Why does broadcasting feel like anything? Why is the global workspace not a global darkness? The theory explains the function. It does not explain the experience. Consider recurrent processing theory developed by Victor Lamy at the University of Amsterdam. Lamy argues that consciousness requires recurrent feedback loops between higher and lower cortical areas. Feed-forward processing is unconscious. Recurrent processing is conscious. When visual information flows from V1 to V2 to V4 to IT cortex in a feed-forward sweep, it is processed unconsciously. When feedback connections send signals back from higher areas to lower areas, creating recurrent loops, the processing becomes conscious. Again, the theory explains a mechanism. It identifies a neural signature. It makes testable predictions. But it does not explain why recurrent processing feels like something while feed-forward processing does not. What is it about feedback loops that generates subjective experience? The theory says recurrence equals consciousness. It does not say why. Every neuroscientific theory of consciousness faces the same problem. The theory identifies a neural mechanism and correlates it with consciousness, but the theory never explains why that mechanism produces experience. The why remains unanswered, and the reason it remains unanswered might be the most important clue we have about the nature of consciousness. The reason might be that consciousness is not produced by neural mechanisms at all, that looking for the neural mechanism that produces consciousness is like looking for the radio component that produces the music. You can disassemble the radio completely. You can identify every transistor, every capacitor, every resistor. You can explain exactly how the radio converts electromagnetic waves into sound. And you will have explained everything about how the radio works, but you will not have produced the music because the music does not originate in the radio. The radio receives it, transmits it, transforms it, but does not produce it. The music comes from somewhere else. The radio is the receiver, not the source. This is not a proof, it is an analogy. Analogies can mislead. But the persistent failure of neuroscience to explain why neural activity produces experience, rather than just explaining which neural activity correlates with experience, is consistent with the possibility that the brain does not produce consciousness, that the brain does something else with consciousness. Something that neuroscience has been measuring all along but misinterpreting. Correlation, not production. Reception, not generation. Filtering, not creating. This possibility that the brain receives rather than produces consciousness has been proposed by some of the greatest minds in the history of science and philosophy. William James at Harvard in 1898. Henri Bergson in France in 1896. Aldous Huxley, who called the brain a reducing valve in the doors of perception in 1954, More recently, David Chalmers has argued that consciousness might be a fundamental feature of reality, not reducible to physical processes. And as we will see, the quantum mechanics of the last century has provided a physical framework in which this possibility is not only philosophically coherent, but scientifically tractable. But I am getting ahead of the evidence. The first thing to establish clearly is that the hard problem is real, that it is not a confusion, not a pseudo-problem that dissolves when you think about it carefully enough, not a failure of imagination that better neuroscience will fix. The hard problem is a genuine gap between two kinds of reality: objective physical processes and subjective experience. And closing that gap requires not just more data, but a fundamentally new understanding of what consciousness is and how it relates to the physical world. The philosopher Daniel Dennett has argued for decades that the hard problem is an illusion, that consciousness is nothing over and above the physical processes in the brain, that qualia do not exist as something separate from neural function, that when we have explained all the functions of consciousness, we have explained consciousness itself. There is nothing left over, no residue, no hard problem, no explanatory gap. This position is called eliminative materialism or deflationary functionalism, and it has serious defenders: Patricia Churchland, Paul Churchland, Keith Frankish, who calls qualia illusionism. They argue that our intuition that consciousness is something special, something different from physical processing, is simply wrong, a cognitive illusion, a trick the brain plays on itself. But Dennett's position has a steep cost, a cost that many scientists and philosophers find too high to pay. It requires denying the reality of subjective experience. It requires saying that the redness of red is not a real phenomenon but a confused way of talking about neural processing. It requires saying that Mary in her black and white room learns nothing new when she sees red for the first time. That the knowledge she gains the first time red light hits her retina is not real knowledge. It requires saying that the felt quality of pain is identical with C-fiber activation, and that there is nothing more to pain than the firing pattern of specific neurons. That the difference between studying pain in a textbook and experiencing a kidney stone is not a difference in kind, but a difference in description of the same thing. And here is the problem with that. The problem that no amount of philosophical cleverness can dissolve. The existence of subjective experience is the most certain fact available to any conscious being, more certain than the existence of the external world, which might be a simulation or a dream or a hallucination, more certain than the laws of physics, which are models that approximate reality, not reality itself. More certain than the claim that the brain produces consciousness, which is a theoretical hypothesis, not an established fact. Because every one of those claims is known through subjective experience. You experience the external world. You experience reading about the laws of physics. You experience the argument that the brain produces consciousness. Deny the reality of subjective experience, and you have denied the foundation on which every other knowledge claim stands, including the knowledge claims of neuroscience itself. You have sawed off the branch you are sitting on. You have used consciousness to argue that consciousness does not exist. The argument is self-defeating in the deepest possible sense. This is where we are after 150 years of neuroscience. The easy problems are being solved at an extraordinary rate. We understand more about the mechanisms of the brain than at any point in human history. We can predict behavior from brain scans. We can decode visual imagery from neural activity. We can read emotional states from patterns of activation. We can even reconstruct the rough content of dreams from fMRI data. The neuroscience is magnificent, but the hard problem has not moved. Not 1 inch, not 1 millimeter. We do not know why there is experience. We do not know how experience arises from physical processes. We do not know what kind of theory would explain it. We do not even know if the question is well formed. We are not stuck, because we lack data. We have more data about the brain than about any other organ in any organism in the history of biology. We are stuck because we might be asking the wrong question, because the entire framework within which the question is posed might be inadequate. Maybe the question is not how does the brain produce consciousness. Maybe that question has no answer because the brain does not produce consciousness. Maybe consciousness is not a product of neural computation, the way heat is a product of friction or light is a product of electroluminescence. Maybe consciousness has a different relationship to the physical world entirely, a relationship that our current scientific framework cannot describe, because the framework was built on the assumption that consciousness is a late-arriving byproduct of sufficient complexity rather than a fundamental feature of PTI, reality. Maybe the question is, what is the relationship between consciousness and the physical world? And maybe answering that question requires not just more neuroscience, but new physics, new concepts, new frameworks. A revolution in our understanding of reality, as profound as the revolution that quantum mechanics brought to our understanding of matter and energy 100 years ago. And that is precisely where quantum mechanics enters this story. Not as mysticism, not as hand-waving about electrons being aware, not as the abuse of physics to justify pre-existing spiritual beliefs, as rigorous physics, the most successful theory in the history of science, a theory that from its very first formulation in the 1920s has been unable to remove the observer from the description of physical reality, a theory that for 100 years has struggled with the measurement problem, the question of how and why quantum systems transition from superposition to definite states when they are observed, a theory in which some of its founders, Werner Heisenberg, Eugene Wigner, John von Neumann, explicitly argued that consciousness is not just relevant to physics, but necessary for physics to work. A theory that might contain within its mathematical structure the answer to the question that neuroscience has been unable to ask, let alone answer. Why does anything feel like anything? Why is there an inside to the universe? Why does the cosmos not process information in the dark? Why is there light? The question stands, open, unanswered, after 150 years, the most important question science has ever faced. And the honest response is not to pretend it has been answered by neural correlates and information integration models. The honest response is to follow the question wherever it leads, even if it leads into territory that materialist science did not expect, even if it leads into the quantum world, even if it leads somewhere that looks uncomfortably like what the contemplative traditions have been describing for 4,000 years. There are only 3 possible relationships between the brain and consciousness. 3 models, 3 frameworks, 3 ways of understanding what the brain does with awareness. Every theory of consciousness ever proposed fits into one of these 3 models. Every argument, every experiment, every philosophical position, every religious tradition, every materialist claim, and every mystical report. They all map onto one of 3 possibilities. Model 1. The brain produces consciousness. This is the factory model, the production model, the standard assumption of modern neuroscience and the default position of Western intellectual culture since the Enlightenment. Consciousness is what the brain does. The brain generates consciousness the way the liver generates bile, the way the kidney generates urine, the way the stomach generates acid. Consciousness is a biological product of neural computation. When neurons fire in the right patterns, consciousness emerges. When the patterns stop, consciousness ceases. No brain, no consciousness. Brain death equals consciousness death. Full stop. This model is simple. It is intuitive for anyone raised in a materialist culture. It has enormous explanatory power for the correlations between brain states and mental states. Damage Broca's area and speech is impaired. Damage the hippocampus and memory formation is impaired. Damage the fusiform face area and face recognition is impaired. Drink alcohol and consciousness is altered. Take anesthesia and consciousness disappears. The correlations between brain and consciousness are so tight, so specific, so reliable that the production model seems obviously true. Of course, the brain produces consciousness. What else could be producing it? Model 2. The brain filters consciousness. This is the filter model, the transmission model, the reducing valve hypothesis. Consciousness exists independently of the brain. The brain does not produce it. The brain receives it, filters it, channels it, narrows it. The way a prism does not produce light, but refracts it, separating white light into specific wavelengths. The way a radio does not produce music, but receives electromagnetic signals and converts them into sound. The way a television does not produce the broadcast, but receives it and displays it on a screen. In this model, consciousness is fundamental. It exists prior to the brain, independent of the brain. The brain is an organ that evolved to filter the vast field of consciousness into the narrow focused beam needed for biological survival. You do not need to be aware of everything. You need to be aware of what is relevant to survival. Food, predators, mates, dangers. The brain takes the infinite field of consciousness and reduces it to the specific focused awareness that helps you navigate the physical world. Damage the brain, and the filter is damaged. The consciousness is distorted. Not because the consciousness has been harmed, but because the filter has been harmed. The signal is fine. The receiver is broken. Model 3. The brain is an antenna for consciousness. This is a variation of the filter model, but with an important difference. In the antenna model, the brain does not just passively filter a pre-existing field of consciousness. The brain actively tunes into consciousness the way a radio antenna tunes into specific frequencies. Different brain states tune into different frequencies of consciousness. Waking consciousness, dreaming consciousness, meditative consciousness, psychedelic consciousness. Each is a different frequency. Each is accessed by a different configuration of neural activity. The brain does not produce these states. The brain accesses them, selects them, tunes into them. These three models make different predictions, and the predictions can be tested against the evidence. Not all the evidence is in. Not all the tests have been conducted, but enough evidence exists to evaluate the models. And the evaluation is more interesting than most people expect. Let us start with what the production model gets right, because it gets a lot right. The correlations between brain states and conscious states are real, and they are spectacular in their specificity. Wilder Penfield, the pioneering neurosurgeon at the Montreal Neurological Institute, spent decades in the 1940s and 1950s electrically stimulating the brains of conscious patients during surgery. The patients were awake because brain surgery can be performed under local anesthesia since the brain itself has no pain receptors. Penfield found that stimulating specific cortical regions produced specific conscious experiences with extraordinary precision. Stimulate the temporal lobe, and patients heard music. Specific music. Songs they recognized from their childhood playing as if from a phonograph inside their head. Stimulate the visual cortex, and they saw flashes of light or complex geometric patterns, or sometimes vivid scenes from memory. Stimulate the somatosensory cortex, and they felt sensations in specific body parts, a tingling in the left thumb, a warmth in the right foot. Stimulate the motor cortex, and their limbs moved involuntarily against their will. Electrode in. Experience out. Factory model confirmed. But Penfield himself reached a different conclusion. After decades of mapping the brain and stimulating it in hundreds of patients, Penfield wrote in his final book, The Mystery of the Mind, published in 1975, that he could not find consciousness in the brain. He could trigger experiences, he could trigger movements, he could trigger memories, but he could never trigger the will. He could never stimulate the sense of being the person who experiences. He could make the hand move, but he could never make the patient feel that they wanted to move the hand. The patient always reported that the stimulation-produced experience felt different from a voluntary experience. It felt imposed, external, not mine. Penfield concluded that consciousness, the observer, the self, the decider, might not be produced by the cortex at all. The man who knew more about brain stimulation than anyone alive in the 20th century concluded that consciousness is not in the brain, not because he was a mystic, because the evidence led him there. Roger Sperry's split brain experiments in the 1960s provided even more dramatic evidence. Sperry studied patients whose corpus callosum, the massive bundle of approximately 200 million nerve fibers connecting the left and right hemispheres, had been surgically severed to treat severe intractable epilepsy. The operation was a last resort. The results for consciousness research were astonishing and earned Sperry the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1981. The two hemispheres became functionally independent. Each hemisphere had its own perceptions, its own memories, its own intentions. The left hemisphere could speak, but the right could not. The right hemisphere could recognize faces and spatial patterns that the left could not. When an image was presented only to the right hemisphere through the left visual field, the patient verbally denied seeing anything because the speaking left hemisphere had no access to the information. But the left hand controlled by the right hemisphere could point to the correct object, one brain, two consciousnesses. If consciousness were independent of the brain, why would cutting a bundle of nerve fibers split it in two? Anesthesia provides another powerful piece of evidence for the production model. Propofol, sevoflurane, isoflurane, ketamine, midazolam. These molecules interact with specific receptors in the brain. GABA-A receptors primarily for propofol and the volatile agents, NMDA receptors for ketamine. They alter the electrochemical activity of neural circuits in precise and predictable ways. Propofol enhances GABAergic inhibition across the cortex, suppressing neural activity globally. The thalamocortical loop that sustains conscious awareness is disrupted. The information integration that Tononi's IIT identifies as the substrate of consciousness collapses and consciousness vanishes. Not gradually, not partially, completely. You are counting backward from 10. You reach 7. You are gone. No experience, no awareness, no inner life, no dreams. No darkness, even because darkness is an experience and there is no experience at all. Nothing. A gap in existence. Then you wake up, and hours have passed that do not exist for you. They happen to the world. They did not happen to you. The precision of this effect is remarkable. An anesthesiologist can titrate consciousness like a dimmer switch. A little propofol, and you are sedated, aware, but drowsy. A little more, and you are unconscious, but still responsive to painful stimuli. A little more, and you are in surgical anesthesia, unresponsive to incision, no experience. The dose-response curve is smooth and predictable. Milligrams of a molecule map directly onto degrees of consciousness. If consciousness is independent of the brain, why would a molecule that changes brain chemistry control it so precisely? This is the production model's strongest evidence, and the filter model must have a response to it. The response is this: anesthesia does not prove that the brain produces consciousness. Anesthesia proves that the brain is necessary for the expression of consciousness through this physical body in this physical world. If the brain is a receiver, then disrupting the receiver disrupts the reception. Turn off the radio, and the music stops coming out of the speaker. Adjust the volume knob, and the music gets louder or quieter. The dose-response curve of anesthesia maps onto the gain of the receiver, not the existence of the signal. The music, the broadcast, the consciousness is still there. The receiver is impaired. The signal continues. The expression of the signal through this particular biological device has been interrupted. When the anesthesia wears off and the receiver comes back online, the signal is received again and consciousness returns. Not because the brain recreated consciousness from scratch, because the brain resumed receiving it. This is not a decisive rebuttal. The production model explains anesthesia just as naturally, and this is important to acknowledge with complete honesty. The production model and the filter model make identical predictions for anesthesia and for most standard neuroscience findings. Both predict that altering the brain alters consciousness. Both predict that damaging the brain damages conscious function. Both predict that specific brain regions correlate with specific conscious experiences. The two models diverge only on the anomalies: terminal lucidity, psychedelic expansion, NDEs during flat EEG. These are the critical test cases, and on the critical test cases, the filter model provides explanations that the production model cannot match. Terminal lucidity, the single most devastating piece of evidence against the production model. Patients with advanced Alzheimer's disease. Their brains have been physically destroyed by the disease over years or decades. Amyloid plaques block synaptic signaling between neurons. Neurofibrillary tangles of hyperphosphorylated tau protein destroy neurons from within. The hippocampus shrinks by 25% or more. The cortex thins dramatically. Total brain volume decreases by 30 to 40%. On MRI, the ventricles are massively enlarged because the brain tissue that once filled the space is gone, physically gone. The neurons that stored memories are dead. The synaptic connections that enabled personality and identity are severed. The hardware is destroyed. These patients have not recognized their family members for years. They have not spoken coherently for months or years. They stare blankly. They do not respond to stimuli. By every neurological measure, the person who once inhabited that brain is gone. The production model predicts that consciousness is irreversibly diminished because the hardware that produces it is irreversibly damaged. You cannot run software on destroyed hardware. You cannot produce music from a smashed piano. And then, in the hours or sometimes minutes before death, these patients become lucid. They recognize their family members by name. They speak coherently and with emotional depth. They recall memories from decades ago, specific memories, shared experiences, names of childhood friends, details of events that no one has discussed with them for years. They express love. They say goodbye. They are fully conscious, fully present, fully themselves, and then they die. This happens in approximately 5 to 10% of patients with severe dementia, according to surveys conducted by Alexander Bathiani at the University of Vienna, who surveyed over 800 caregivers. Michael Nahm has documented cases systematically in the medical literature. The phenomenon has been recognized by physicians since at least Hippocrates. It is not rare. It is not anecdotal. It is a documented clinical phenomenon observed by thousands of medical professionals across centuries. The production model cannot explain this. The neurons are dead, the synapses are severed, the cortex is atrophied, the hippocampus is shrunken, the hardware is destroyed, and yet full consciousness returns, full memory returns, full personality returns, for minutes or hours, before the final death. The filter model explains it effortlessly. If the brain filters consciousness rather than producing it, then the destruction of the filter by Alzheimer's disease does not destroy consciousness. It distorts it, blocks it, prevents it from being expressed through the damaged medium. Terminal lucidity is the moment when the dying brain's filtering function breaks down completely. The restriction lifts. The full consciousness floods through, briefly. Before the receiver fails entirely, the signal was always there. The receiver was too damaged to pick it up. At the moment of death, the receiver's restrictions collapse, and the signal comes through one final time. The production model predicts that brain destruction always reduces consciousness. The filter model predicts that brain destruction usually reduces consciousness, but paradoxically might increase it when the filtering mechanism itself breaks down. Terminal lucidity matches the filter model's prediction. It contradicts the production model's prediction. Now consider the psychedelic evidence: psilocybin, LSD, DMT, ayahuasca, mescaline. These substances produce some of the most profound and vivid conscious experiences that human beings have ever reported. Mystical experiences rated by participants as among the most meaningful events of their entire lives. Experiences of cosmic unity, dissolution of the boundary between self and world. Encounters with what subjects describe as ultimate reality. The experiences are extraordinary in their vividness, their emotional depth, and their lasting impact on personality and well-being. The production model predicts that enhanced consciousness requires enhanced brain activity. More vivid experience requires more neural firing. More meaning requires more computational complexity. More consciousness requires more brain. Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial College London used fMRI and magnetoencephalography to measure brain activity during psilocybin experiences. His 2012 study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, was a landmark. What he found was the opposite of what the production model predicts. Psilocybin did not increase brain activity, it decreased it dramatically. Specifically, it decreased activity in the default mode network, the set of brain regions most associated with the sense of self, with narrative identity, with the ego, with the autobiographical storytelling that constitutes your moment-to-moment sense of being you. The medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the precuneus. These regions form the core of the default mode network. Psilocybin suppressed their activity, and the greater the suppression, the more profound the subjective experience. Participants who showed the largest decreases in default mode network activity reported the most vivid, the most meaningful, the most mystical experiences. Less brain activity, more consciousness, not slightly more, profoundly more. Participants described these experiences as among the most meaningful of their entire lives. More meaningful than the birth of a child, more meaningful than the death of a parent, more meaningful than falling in love. Johns Hopkins researchers led by Roland Griffiths confirmed this in controlled trials published in 2006 and 2011 Inches, the journal Psychopharmacology. 14 months after a single psilocybin session, 94% of participants rated the experience as one of the 5 most spiritually significant of their lives. 67% rated it as the single most meaningful experience or among the top 5. The production model says this should not happen. If the brain produces consciousness, then reducing brain activity should reduce consciousness, not amplify it to the most meaningful experience of a person's life. If the factory model is correct, then shutting down parts of the factory should reduce output, not produce the most extraordinary product the factory has ever made. The filter model explains this directly. If the brain filters consciousness by restricting the flow of awareness to a narrow, focused beam, then reducing the brain's filtering activity should widen the beam. Less filtering means more consciousness gets through. The default mode network, according to this interpretation, is not the seat of consciousness. It is the primary restriction on consciousness. It is the reducing valve that William James and Aldous Huxley described. Psilocybin opens the valve. The consciousness that was always there beyond the filter floods in. The brain did not produce the expanded consciousness. The brain stopped restricting it. Meditation produces a milder version of the same effect. Long-term meditators show decreased activity in the default mode network during deep practice. Andrew Newberg's neuroimaging studies at Thomas Jefferson University show decreased activity in the posterior superior parietal lobe during peak contemplative states. This is the brain region that constructs the boundary between self and world. When it quiets, the boundary dissolves. The meditator reports an experience of unity, of expanded awareness, of consciousness without the usual restrictions. Again, less brain activity correlates with more consciousness. The production model struggles with this. The filter model predicts it. The split brain evidence cuts both ways. Yes, cutting the corpus callosum splits consciousness into two streams. This seems to support the production model, but consider it more carefully. If the brain produces consciousness, then cutting connections should reduce consciousness. You have damaged the system. You have reduced its integration. But Sperry's patients did not experience less consciousness. They experienced two consciousnesses. The total amount of conscious experience arguably increased rather than decreased. Each hemisphere was independently conscious. Each had its own perceptions, intentions, and responses. Cutting the brain in half did not halve consciousness. It doubled it. The filter model handles this elegantly. If the brain filters consciousness, then the corpus callosum is part of the filtering mechanism that unifies the two hemispheres processing into a single stream of awareness. Cut the filter and you get two streams. Not less consciousness, different consciousness. The unified filtering mechanism is damaged, so the consciousness that was being unified into one stream now comes through as two streams. The total consciousness is not reduced. The organization of consciousness is changed. Anesthesia is the production model's strongest evidence. Molecules alter brain chemistry and consciousness disappears. This seems conclusive. But the filter model has a response. Anesthesia does not prove that the brain produces consciousness. Anesthesia proves that the brain is necessary for the expression of consciousness in this physical body. If the brain is a receiver, then disrupting the receiver disrupts the reception. Turn off the radio and the music stops coming out of the speaker. This does not prove the radio produces the music. It proves the radio is necessary for the music to be heard in this room. The music, the broadcast, is still there. The receiver is off. The signal continues. The expression of the signal through this particular device has been interrupted. This is not a decisive argument. The production model can also explain the anesthesia data, and this is important to acknowledge honestly. The production model and the filter model both explain anesthesia. Both explain the correlations between brain damage and consciousness impairment. Both explain why alcohol affects consciousness. Both explain why sleep alters consciousness. The two models make identical predictions for most of the standard neuroscience evidence. They diverge on the anomalies. Terminal lucidity, psychedelic expansion, near-death experiences during flat EEG. These are the test cases. And on the test cases, the filter model outperforms the production model. There is one more piece of evidence that deserves attention: the placebo effect and its implications for the relationship between mind and brain. The placebo effect is the measurable physiological change that occurs when a patient believes they are receiving treatment even when they are receiving an inert substance, a sugar pill, a saline injection, a sham surgery. The patient believes the treatment is real, and the body responds as if it were real. Pain decreases, inflammation decreases, Parkinson's tremors decrease. The immune system responds. Measurable, objective physiological changes produced by a subjective belief. By consciousness. Fabrizio Benedetti at the University of Turin has spent decades studying the placebo effect with rigorous methodology. His work has shown that placebo analgesia involves the release of endogenous opioids measurable in the blood. That placebo treatment for Parkinson's disease involves the release of dopamine in the striatum measurable by PET scan. That the placebo effect is not imaginary. It is not the patient pretending to feel better. It is a real physiological response mediated by specific neurochemical pathways that are activated by belief. The production model says consciousness is produced by the brain, but the placebo effect shows consciousness altering the brain, belief a conscious mental state changing neurochemistry, an objective physical state. If consciousness is just what neurons do, then how does a mental state reach down and change the neurons that supposedly produce it? If consciousness is the output of neural computation, then how does the output modify the computation that generates it? The causal arrow goes the wrong way. In the production model, the arrow goes from brain to consciousness. In the placebo effect, the arrow goes from consciousness to brain. Mental causation, top-down causation, the mind changing the body. The production model can accommodate the placebo effect by describing it as neural circuits influencing other neural circuits. Prefrontal expectations, modulating pain circuits. Higher order representations altering lower order processing. Everything stays within the neural framework. This is a legitimate interpretation, but it requires treating consciousness as causally efficacious, as something that does real work in the world. That changes physical states. And once you admit that consciousness has causal power, you have admitted that consciousness is not merely an epiphenomenon, not merely the exhaust fume of neural computation, but a real force that shapes physical reality. And this concession opens the door to the deeper question. If consciousness can alter the brain, then what is the fundamental relationship between the two? Is consciousness really just what neurons produce? Or is the relationship more complex, more bidirectional, more mysterious than the simple production model allows? Here is the honest summary, and I want to be precise about what the evidence does and does not show. The production model is supported by the correlations between brain states and conscious states, by the effects of brain damage on consciousness in the vast majority of cases, by anesthesia, which reliably eliminates consciousness by altering brain chemistry, by electrical stimulation, which can trigger specific experiences by activating specific neural regions, by split brain experiments which show that severing neural connections alters the unity of consciousness, by lesion studies which show that destroying specific brain regions destroys specific conscious capacities, by neuropharmacology which shows that specific molecules targeting specific receptors alter specific aspects of experience. This evidence is real and powerful and extensive. It fills libraries. The filter model is supported by terminal lucidity, which shows that full consciousness can return in a brain that is physically destroyed by disease, by the psychedelic evidence which shows that reducing brain activity can expand consciousness rather than diminish it, by Penfield's own conclusion, after decades of brain stimulation, that consciousness itself, the observer, the will, the self, cannot be found in or produced by the cortex, by the paradox of split brain patients apparently having two consciousnesses rather than half a consciousness after the corpus callosum is severed, by near-death experiences in which patients report structured, vivid conscious experiences during periods of flat EEG when the cortex has no measurable electrical activity, by the placebo effect which demonstrates that conscious states can alter physical brain states, suggesting that consciousness has causal power over the brain rather than merely being produced by it. This evidence is also real, also documented, also published in peer-reviewed journals, and it is growing. Neither model has been proven. Neither has been disproven. The evidence supports elements of both and falsifies the most extreme claims of each. The production model's strongest claim, that consciousness is entirely and exclusively produced by neural computation and nothing else, is falsified by terminal lucidity, where full consciousness returns in a physically destroyed brain. The filter model's strongest claim, that consciousness is entirely independent of neural activity and the brain is merely a passive receiver, is falsified by the reliable effects of anesthesia and the precise correlations between brain damage and specific consciousness deficits. The truth, as is often the case in science, might be more complex and more interesting than either model captures in isolation. The brain might both produce and receive, both generate and filter. It might produce certain aspects of consciousness, the specific content of visual experience, the particular emotional coloring, the detailed texture of perception, while receiving or transmitting other aspects, the fundamental awareness, the basic capacity for subjective experience, the ground of being, in which all specific experiences occur, local content produced by the brain, global awareness, received from something deeper, something more fundamental, something that exists prior to the formation of the brain and persists after the brain ceases to function. What that something might be, how it relates to the physical brain, how it can be both independent of neural computation and yet intimately connected to it, how it can survive the death of neurons and yet be affected by the chemistry of anesthesia. These questions require a framework that transcends the classical physics on which neuroscience is built. Classical physics describes a world of objects and forces, billiard balls bouncing off each other, deterministic, local, mechanical. In classical physics, there is no room for consciousness as anything other than a byproduct of sufficient mechanical complexity. There is no place for consciousness in the equations, no term, no variable, no role. But quantum mechanics is different. Quantum mechanics, from its very first formulation in the 1920s, has been unable to remove consciousness from the description of physical reality. The measurement problem, the observer effect, the collapse of the wave function. For 100 years, the most successful theory in physics has struggled with a question that sounds remarkably like the hard problem of consciousness turned inside out. The hard problem asks, how does the physical world produce consciousness? The measurement problem asks, how does consciousness affect the physical world? They are mirror images of each other, two sides of the same coin. And the possibility that they have the same answer is the most important idea in the science of consciousness today. The measurement problem, the observer, the wave function, the collapse, and the question that has divided physicists for a century: does consciousness play a fundamental role in the operation of physical reality at the quantum level? Not as mysticism, not as metaphor, as physics, as mathematics, as the most rigorously tested theory in the history of science, suggesting that the hard problem and the measurement problem are one problem, and that solving one might solve both. In 1927, the most successful theory in the history of science was born, and it had a problem at its heart that has never been solved. A problem that, after nearly 100 years of debate, still divides physicists into warring camps. A problem that sounds like philosophy but is actually physics. A problem that connects directly to the question of what consciousness is and what role it plays in the operation of physical reality. The measurement problem. Here is the setup. Quantum mechanics describes the physical world at the smallest scales: atoms, electrons, photons, quarks. At these scales, physical systems do not behave the way everyday objects behave. An electron does not have a definite position the way a tennis ball does. Before you measure it, the electron exists in a superposition of all possible positions simultaneously, not in one place or another, in all places at once. This is not a metaphor. This is what the mathematics says. The wave function, the central mathematical object in quantum mechanics, assigns a probability amplitude to every possible position. The electron is spread across space, smeared, delocalized. It does not have a position. It has a probability distribution over positions. Then you measure it. You look. You set up a detector. You interact with the electron in a way that extracts information about its position. And something happens. Something that quantum mechanics describes but does not explain. The wave function collapses. The superposition vanishes. The electron, which was spread across all possible positions, is now found at one specific position, definite, located here and not there. The measurement has transformed the electron from a cloud of possibilities into a single actuality. This is the measurement problem. What caused the collapse? What transformed possibility into actuality? What selected this particular position out of the infinite continuum of possible positions? The mathematics of quantum mechanics does not answer this question. The Schrödinger equation describes how the wave function evolves over time. It is smooth, continuous, deterministic, linear. It never produces collapse. It never selects one outcome from among the possibilities. The collapse is something extra, something added to the formalism from outside, something that happens when a measurement occurs but is not described by the fundamental equation. And here is where consciousness enters physics, not through mysticism, through the logical structure of the theory itself. The Copenhagen interpretation, formulated primarily by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg in the late 1920s, was the first attempt to deal with a measurement problem. Bohr argued that quantum mechanics describes the results of measurements, not the underlying reality. The wave function is not a description of what the electron is doing when you are not looking. It is a mathematical tool for predicting what you will find when you do look. The measurement is fundamental. The observer is fundamental. Without an observer making a measurement, the question of what the electron is doing has no meaning. There is no quantum reality independent of the act of observation. Reality at the quantum level is participatory. The observer is not a passive spectator watching nature from outside. The observer is a participant whose act of measurement helps create the reality being measured. Heisenberg was explicit about this. He wrote in Physics and Philosophy, published in 1958, that the atoms or elementary particles themselves are not real. They form a world of potentialities or possibilities rather than one of things or facts. The transition from the possible to the actual takes place during the act of observation. This is not a minor interpretive gloss. This is one of the founders of quantum mechanics stating that physical reality at the fundamental level requires an observer to become actual. Possibility becomes actuality through the act of conscious observation. John von Neumann made this more rigorous in his 1932 book, Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. Von Neumann was one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century. He invented game theory. He designed the architecture that still defines how computers work. He contributed foundational work to set theory, functional analysis, and ergodic theory. He was not a mystic. He was a mathematician of the highest precision. Von Neumann analyzed the measurement problem with mathematical rigor and discovered something disturbing. He traced the chain of physical interactions that occurs during a measurement. A photon hits the detector. The detector registers the photon. The signal travels through wires to an amplifier. The amplifier sends a signal to a display. The display shows a number. The light from the display hits the retina. The retina sends signals through the optic nerve to the visual cortex. The visual cortex processes the signal. At what point in this chain does the wave function collapse? At what point does the superposition of possible outcomes become a single, actual outcome? Von Neumann showed mathematically that you can place the collapse at any point in the physical chain, and the predictions of quantum mechanics remain the same. The collapse can occur at the detector, or at the amplifier, or at the display, or at the retina, or at the visual cortex. The physics is the same. There is no physical criterion that determines where the collapse happens. The chain of physical interactions is just quantum mechanics all the way through. Each physical component is itself a quantum system that becomes entangled with the previous one, creating a larger and larger superposition. The detector is in a superposition of having detected the photon here and having detected the photon there. The amplifier is in a superposition. The display is in a superposition. The retina is in a superposition. The visual cortex is in a superposition. The physical chain never collapses on its own, unless something non-physical intervenes. Von Neumann concluded that the collapse occurs at the boundary between the physical world and the conscious observer. Consciousness is the only thing in the chain that is not described by quantum mechanics. Consciousness is not a quantum system that becomes entangled with the rest of the chain. Consciousness is the terminus of the chain, the point at which possibilities become actualities, the point at which the superposition resolves into a definite experience. Von Neumann placed consciousness at the center of quantum mechanics, not as an interpretation, as a mathematical result. The chain of physical interactions never produces collapse. Only consciousness does. Eugene Wigner took this further. Wigner was another towering figure in 20th century physics, Nobel Prize in 1963, for his work on the symmetry properties of nuclear forces. Wigner proposed a thought experiment now called Wigner's friend. Wigner's friend is in a laboratory and performs a quantum measurement. According to the Copenhagen interpretation, the friend's measurement collapses the wave function. The friend sees a definite result, but Wigner is outside the laboratory. From Wigner's perspective, the entire laboratory, including the friend, is a quantum system. Until Wigner himself makes an observation, the friend and the laboratory are in a superposition of the friend saw result A and the friend saw result B. The friend's consciousness collapsed the wave function from the friend's perspective, but from Wigner's perspective no collapse has occurred. This creates a contradiction. The friend experienced a definite result. Wigner describes the friend as still being in a superposition. Which description is correct? Wigner's answer was radical. Consciousness cannot be in a superposition. The moment a conscious being becomes aware of a measurement result, the wave function collapses. Not just for that observer, objectively, universally. Consciousness has a special status in physics. It is not just another physical system subject to quantum rules. It is the thing that causes physical systems to have definite states rather than indefinite superpositions. Consciousness is what makes reality real, what converts the fog of quantum possibility into the solid ground of experienced actuality. This is not a historical curiosity. In 2018, Daniela Frauschiger and Renato Renner at ETH Zurich published a thought experiment in Nature Communications that extended Wigner's friend into a rigorous no-go theorem. They showed that quantum mechanics cannot consistently describe the use of itself by multiple observers. If both Wigner and his friend apply quantum mechanics consistently, they arrive at contradictory predictions about measurement outcomes. The theorem forces a choice. Either quantum mechanics does not apply to conscious observers, or there are no objective measurement outcomes, or some other fundamental assumption must be abandoned. The paper reignited the debate about the role of consciousness in quantum mechanics at the highest level of physics. The measurement problem is not a relic of the 1930s. It is a living, active research problem in 2020s physics now. I must be honest about the controversy. Von Neumann's and Wigner's position that consciousness causes collapse is a minority position in modern physics. Most physicists today prefer interpretations that do not give consciousness a special role. Decoherence theory, developed by H. Dieter Zeh and Wojciech Zurek, explains how quantum superpositions become effectively classical through interaction with the environment. When a quantum system interacts with the billions of particles in its surroundings, the superposition does not collapse, but it becomes unobservable. The interference terms that distinguish a quantum superposition from a classical mixture are diluted across so many environmental degrees of freedom that no practical measurement can detect them. The system behaves as if it has collapsed even though the fundamental wave function remains in superposition. Consciousness plays no role. The environment does the work. The many worlds interpretation proposed by Hugh Everett in 1957 takes a different approach. The wave function never collapses. Every possible outcome of every quantum measurement is realized in a separate branch of a universal wave function. When you measure the electron and find it at position A, there is another branch of reality in which you found it at position B. Both outcomes are real. Both copies of you are real. Consciousness plays no special role. You just happen to find yourself in one branch rather than another. These interpretations avoid giving consciousness a fundamental role in physics. And they are legitimate. They are mathematically consistent. They make the same empirical predictions as the Copenhagen interpretation. The measurement problem has not been solved. It has been dissolved in different ways by different interpretations, and there is no experiment that distinguishes between them. But here is what the critics of consciousness-based interpretations must acknowledge. Decoherence does not solve the measurement problem. It explains why superpositions become unobservable. It does not explain why one outcome is observed rather than another. It explains the disappearance of interference. It does not explain the appearance of a definite result. The transition from possible to actual remains unexplained. Zeh himself acknowledged this. Zurek acknowledges this. Decoherence is a mechanism within quantum mechanics. It does not provide the interpretation of quantum mechanics. The question of what constitutes a measurement and why measurements produce definite outcomes remains open. And the many worlds interpretation has its own deep problem. If every outcome is realized, then the concept of probability becomes mysterious. Why does quantum mechanics predict specific probabilities for specific outcomes if every outcome occurs with certainty in some branch? The Born rule, the rule that relates the wave function to probabilities, becomes an unexplained assumption rather than a derived result. And the question of why you experience this branch rather than another becomes a new version of the hard problem, a consciousness problem inside an interpretation that was designed to eliminate consciousness problems. The honest assessment is that the measurement problem remains unsolved. After nearly 100 years, every interpretation has strengths and weaknesses. None is universally accepted, and the role of consciousness in quantum mechanics remains an open question. Not a settled question, not a dismissed question, an open question, debated by serious physicists at serious institutions, publishing in serious journals. This is the context in which the quantum theories of consciousness must be understood. They are not mystical speculation imported into physics from outside. They are attempts to solve two problems simultaneously: the hard problem of consciousness in neuroscience and the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. The possibility that these are the same problem is the deepest insight driving quantum consciousness research. Roger Penrose approached this from the physics side. Penrose's argument is precise and technical. In quantum mechanics, the wave function evolves smoothly and deterministically according to the Schrödinger equation. This is called U-process, or unitary evolution. Then a measurement occurs, and the wave function collapses to a definite state. This is called R-process, or state reduction. U-process is smooth, deterministic, and reversible. R-process is abrupt, probabilistic, and irreversible. They are fundamentally different processes, and standard quantum mechanics provides no physical mechanism for the transition from U to R. The collapse is added by hand, postulated, not derived. Penrose proposed that the collapse is a real physical process, not caused by consciousness, not caused by decoherence, caused by gravity. When a quantum system exists in superposition of two states that differ in their mass distribution and therefore in their space-time geometry, the superposition becomes gravitationally unstable. The two geometries cannot coexist indefinitely. After a time that depends on the energy difference between the two states, the superposition spontaneously collapses. This is objective reduction, or it happens whether anyone observes it or not. It is built into the structure of space-time itself. And Penrose proposed that each OR event is a moment of proto-consciousness, a flicker of awareness. an elementary experience. Consciousness is not added to physics from outside. Consciousness is built into the collapse process. Every quantum state reduction everywhere in the universe involves a moment of proto-conscious experience. Stuart Hameroff provided the biological connection. Microtubules, protein cylinders inside every neuron composed of tubulin dimers arranged in a lattice structure. Each tubulin dimer has two conformational states. Hameroff proposed that tubulin dimers function as quantum bits, that they can exist in superposition of both states simultaneously. That quantum coherence can propagate along the microtubule lattice. That large-scale quantum superpositions develop across networks of microtubules in networks of neurons, and that when these superpositions reach the gravitational threshold for objective reduction, they collapse. Simultaneously, coherently, across the entire neural network. This orchestrated collapse is Orch-OR, orchestrated objective reduction, and each Orch-OR event is a moment of conscious experience, not proto-consciousness, full consciousness, unified, integrated, the binding of disparate neural processes into a single moment of awareness. The model is specific. It makes quantitative predictions. The collapse time depends on the mass-energy difference between the superposed states through the relation T equals h bar divided by Eg, where T is the collapse time, h bar is the reduced Planck constant, and Eg is the gravitational self-energy of the superposition. For microtubule superpositions involving roughly 10 to the power of 10 tubulin dimers, the collapse time is approximately 25 milliseconds. This corresponds to the 40 Hz gamma oscillation that is empirically associated with conscious awareness in EEG studies. The theory predicts a specific timescale for consciousness, and that timescale matches observed neural oscillations. This is not a vague philosophical speculation. This is a quantitative prediction that connects quantum gravity to neural dynamics to conscious experience. The model also makes a specific prediction about anesthesia that connects to the evidence from Part 2. Hameroff has argued that anesthetic gases work not primarily through their effects on membrane receptors, as the standard pharmacological model assumes, but through their interaction with hydrophobic pockets in tubulin proteins within microtubules. Anesthetic molecules are small nonpolar molecules that dissolve in hydrophobic environments. They bind within the same hydrophobic pockets inside tubulin, where the quantum states relevant to Orch-OR are proposed to occur. By occupying these pockets, anesthetics disrupt the quantum coherence in tubulin. They prevent the quantum superpositions from forming. No superposition means no orchestrated objective reduction. No Orch-OR means no consciousness. The patient goes under. This provides a mechanistic explanation for anesthesia at the quantum level, and it makes a testable prediction. If Orch-OR is correct, then the binding of anesthetic molecules to tubulin hydrophobic pockets should correlate more tightly with loss of consciousness than the binding of anesthetics to membrane receptors. Preliminary evidence from Hameroff's group suggests this correlation exists, though it remains contested. The objections are serious and must be stated honestly. Max Tegmark published a calculation in 2000, arguing that quantum coherence in microtubules would be destroyed by thermal decoherence in approximately 10 to the minus 13 seconds, 1/10 trillionth of a second. Far too short for any biologically relevant process. The brain is too warm, too wet, too noisy. Quantum coherence cannot survive long enough to matter. But Tegmark's calculation has been challenged. Hameroff and Penrose responded that Tegmark modelled the wrong system. He calculated decoherence for superpositions of tubulin separation at the scale of the entire protein. But the relevant quantum states in Orch-OR are electronic states within hydrophobic pockets inside the tubulin protein. These pockets are shielded from the thermal environment by the protein structure itself. The relevant decoherence time is orders of magnitude longer than Tegmark calculated. Travis Craddock and Jack Tuszynski at the University of Alberta published computational models in 2014 showing that quantum coherence in tubulin could persist for microseconds to milliseconds at biological temperature, when the shielding effect of the protein structure is properly accounted for, and the quantum biology revolution confirmed what Tegmark's calculations said was impossible. Quantum coherence in the FMO, photosynthetic complex, persists for hundreds of femtoseconds at biological temperature. Quantum entanglement in cryptochrome proteins in bird retinas persists for microseconds at body temperature. Quantum tunneling operates continuously in enzyme catalysis. The brain is warm and wet and noisy. So is a leaf. So is a bird's eye. And quantum mechanics operates in both. The categorical claim that quantum coherence is impossible in biological systems has been falsified by experimental evidence. The question is not whether quantum effects operate in biology. They do. The question is whether the specific quantum effects proposed by Orch-OR operate in microtubules. And Bandyopadhyay's 2014 detection of quantum vibrations in microtubules at multiple frequency scales is evidence that they do. There are other quantum consciousness theories that deserve attention. Henry Stapp at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory has developed a theory based on von Neumann's framework in which conscious intention causes the quantum Zeno effect. The quantum Zeno effect is a real phenomenon in which frequent observation of a quantum system prevents it from evolving. Stapp proposes that the act of conscious attention is a rapid sequence of quantum measurements on the brain's neural state. Each measurement collapses the wave function and holds the brain in the attended state. Free will is the ability to choose which quantum measurements to make, which neural states to attend to, which possibilities to actualize through conscious observation. The theory connects consciousness to quantum mechanics through a well-established physical effect and provides a mechanism for mental causation. How consciousness can affect the physical brain without violating any law of physics. David Bohm's implicate order provides yet another framework. Bohm, a protege of Einstein and one of the most original and creative physicists of the 20th century, proposed that quantum mechanics reveals a reality far deeper than the manifest world of separate objects in space and time. Bohm had extraordinary credentials. His 1951 textbook on quantum mechanics was praised by Einstein himself. He made foundational contributions to plasma physics. He discovered the Aharonov-Bohm effect, demonstrating that electromagnetic potentials have physical reality even in regions where the fields are zero. He was not a fringe thinker. He was a physicist of the first rank who spent decades exploring the deepest implications of quantum theory. Bohm proposed that the manifest world, what we see and measure, is the explicate order, the unfolded order, the world of distinct objects occupying distinct locations in space and time. But beneath this manifest reality lies the implicate order, the unfolded order, a holographic field of infinite depth in which everything is enfolded into everything else. Every part contains information about the whole. Every region of space contains the entire universe in implicate form. Consciousness and matter are not separate substances belonging to different ontological categories. They are different aspects of the same underlying reality, different projections of the implicate order into the explicate world. The way a hologram projected from different angles shows different images, but all the images derive from the same holographic plate. Consciousness does not emerge from matter. Matter does not produce consciousness. Both consciousness and matter emerge from something deeper, something that Bohm called the hollow movement, something that is neither purely physical nor purely mental, something that is both simultaneously, something that our current conceptual framework with its rigid separation between mind and matter cannot adequately describe. The very distinction between consciousness and physical reality is an artifact of the explicate order. In the implicate order, the distinction does not exist. Bohm's framework dissolves the hard problem by rejecting the assumption that causes it. The hard problem arises because we assume consciousness and matter are fundamentally different kinds of thing, and then ask how one produces the other. Bohm says they are not different kinds of thing. They are different expressions of the same thing. The question of how matter produces consciousness is based on a false premise. Matter does not produce consciousness. Both are produced by the implicate order. The relationship between brain and consciousness is not production but co-expression, parallel manifestations of a deeper unified reality. The brain does not generate consciousness any more than a whirlpool generates water. The whirlpool is a pattern in the water. The brain is a pattern in the hollow movement. Consciousness is another pattern in the same hollow movement. They are related not because one causes the other, but because both arise from the same source. Where does all of this leave us? Quantum mechanics, after nearly 100 years, still cannot remove the observer from the description of physical reality. Not in the Copenhagen interpretation, where the observer's measurement creates the definite result. Not in the von Neumann chain, where consciousness is the terminus of the measurement process. Not in Wigner's analysis, where consciousness cannot be in superposition. Not even in decoherence theory, which explains why superpositions become unobservable, but not why definite outcomes are observed. Not even in many worlds, which replaces the measurement problem with the consciousness problem of why I experience this branch. The measurement problem and the hard problem of consciousness may be the same problem. Both ask how the possible becomes the actual. In quantum mechanics, the question is, how does a superposition of possible outcomes become one actual outcome? In consciousness, the question is, how does the objective physical process of neural activity become the actual subjective experience of awareness? Both involve a transition from a spread of possibilities to a single definite reality. Both involve something that the current mathematical framework cannot derive from first principles. Both remain unsolved after decades of effort by the best minds in physics and neuroscience. Orch-OR proposes that they are literally the same process, that the collapse of the quantum wave function in microtubules is the moment of conscious experience, that consciousness does not emerge from quantum mechanics or result from quantum mechanics, that consciousness is quantum mechanics at the level of space-time geometry. Every collapse is a moment of experience. Every moment of experience is a collapse. The hard problem and the measurement problem are one problem with one answer, and the answer is that consciousness and the actualization of physical reality are the same event seen from two perspectives. From inside, it is experience. From outside, it is measurement. This is a radical claim. It has not been proven. It might be wrong in its specific mechanism. The microtubule hypothesis might be incorrect. The gravitational threshold might not work as proposed. The quantum coherence times might be too short even with shielding. These are real possibilities that honesty demands I state. But the deeper insight survives even if the specific mechanism fails. The insight is this: the hard problem of consciousness and the measurement problem of quantum mechanics share the same logical structure. Both involve a transition from possibility to actuality that the current mathematical framework cannot explain. Both involve something that resists reduction to purely physical description. Both have persisted for decades despite enormous effort by brilliant minds. The coincidence is too deep to ignore. Two of the greatest unsolved problems in science have the same structure. The most parsimonious explanation is that they are the same problem. And if they are the same problem, then consciousness is not an afterthought in the universe, not a late arriving byproduct of neural complexity, not an epiphenomenon floating uselessly above the physical processes that truly matter. Consciousness is woven into the fabric of physical reality at the deepest level, at the level where possibilities become actualities, at the level where the quantum world becomes the classical world, at the level where reality itself is decided. This is what quantum mechanics suggests about consciousness. not as mysticism, not as certainty, as a possibility supported by the mathematical structure of the most successful theory in physics, a possibility that connects the deepest problems in two different sciences, a possibility that, if confirmed, would represent the most profound revolution in human understanding since the discovery of quantum mechanics itself. What this means for the ancient question of what consciousness is, how it relates to the physical world, whether the contemplative traditions were describing something real when they placed awareness at the foundation of reality. That is where we go next. 4,000 years before the measurement problem, before the hard problem, before neuroscience existed as a discipline, before the word neuron was coined, before anyone had seen a brain cell under a microscope, contemplative traditions across every continent on Earth were investigating consciousness. Not from outside with instruments and equations, from inside, using the instrument of consciousness itself. And they arrived at conclusions that sound remarkably like what quantum mechanics is now suggesting. This is not an argument from authority. Ancient traditions being right about something does not make them right about everything. And convergence between ancient descriptions and modern physics does not prove that either description is correct, but the convergence is worth examining. Because when two completely independent methods of investigation conducted thousands of years apart using entirely different methodologies arrive at structurally similar descriptions of the same phenomenon, it is worth asking whether they are describing the same reality. Hinduism developed the most systematic analysis of consciousness in the ancient world. The Sanskrit term is chit, pure awareness, not awareness of something, awareness itself, the capacity for experience prior to any specific experience. The Mandukya Upanishad, composed approximately 800 BCE, identifies 4 states of consciousness. Vaishvanara is waking consciousness, the state you are in right now, awareness directed outward toward the physical world through the senses. Taijasa is dreaming consciousness, awareness directed inward toward mental images and narratives generated by the mind itself. Prajna is deep, dreamless sleep, not unconsciousness, a state of consciousness without content, awareness without objects, bliss without experience of bliss, the absence of specific experience but not the absence of awareness itself. And Turiya, the 4th, not a state alongside the other 3, the ground of all 3. The pure awareness that is present in waking and dreaming and deep sleep as the unchanging witness. Turiya is not produced by the brain. Turiya is not a state that comes and goes. Turiya is consciousness itself, the screen on which all states appear, the light by which all experiences are illuminated, always present, never changing, not affected by the content that appears within it. The Mandukya Upanishad's analysis maps onto a specific claim about the brain-consciousness relationship. If Turiya is the ground state of consciousness that persists through waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, then consciousness is not produced by the brain states associated with waking. Consciousness is present even when those brain states are absent. During deep sleep, the cortex is largely offline. The thalamocortical loops that sustain waking consciousness are disrupted. The default mode network is suppressed. If consciousness is produced by these neural processes, then consciousness should be absent during deep sleep. The Mandukya says it is not absent. It is present but without content. Awareness without objects. This is structurally identical to the filter model. The brain in deep sleep stops filtering consciousness into specific content. The content disappears. The consciousness remains. Buddhism investigated consciousness with equal rigor, but arrived at a different ontological conclusion. The Buddhist term is vijnana, usually translated as consciousness, but more precisely meaning cognizing or knowing. Buddhism identifies 6 primary consciousnesses corresponding to the 6 sense bases: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, mind consciousness. Each arises dependent on a sense organ, a sense object, and the meeting of the two. Eye consciousness arises when a functioning eye meets a visible form. Remove the eye or the form and eye consciousness ceases. Consciousness in the Buddhist analysis is always consciousness of something. There is no pure awareness without content, no turiya. This is the critical disagreement with Hinduism. But the Yogacara school of Buddhism developed a deeper analysis. Yogacara identifies 8 consciousnesses, the 6 sense consciousnesses. Manas, the self-referential consciousness that creates the illusion of a permanent self by constantly grasping at the stream of experience and claiming it as mine. This is my thought. This is my feeling. This is my body. Manas is the narrator, the one who constructs the story of self from the raw material of moment-to-moment experience. And alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness, the deepest layer, a continuously flowing stream of consciousness that carries the seeds bija of all experiences and all karmic impressions. Alaya vijnana is not a self. It is not permanent. It is not unchanging. It is a process, a river, a flow. But it is deeper than the brain. It is deeper than any individual life. The seeds in the storehouse consciousness were planted by actions in previous lives, and they ripen into experiences in this life and future lives. The storehouse is the Buddhist mechanism of continuity without substance, the stream that connects life to life without any permanent thing that moves between them. Modern neuroscience has found a striking correlate to the Buddhist analysis of manas, the default mode network, the set of brain regions that activates when you are not focused on external tasks, when you are daydreaming, ruminating, thinking about yourself, planning the future, reviewing the past, constructing the narrative of who you are. The default mode network is the neural correlate of the self-story, and when it is suppressed by meditation or psilocybin, the sense of self dissolves, the narrative stops, and what remains is awareness without a narrator, experience without an experiencer. Exactly what the Buddhist contemplatives described 2,500 years ago. They mapped the phenomenology with precision. Neuroscience is now confirming the neural correlates of their map. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition developed specific meditative technologies for investigating consciousness directly. Rigpa in Dzogchen practice is the recognition of pure awareness itself, not awareness of an object. Awareness, aware of its own nature. The practitioner learns to rest in the natural state of mind prior to conceptual elaboration, prior to the self-narrative, prior to the division between subject and object. What remains, when all content is allowed to dissolve, is not nothing. It is luminous awareness, clear, open, without center or periphery, without beginning or end. The Tibetan term is ozul, luminosity, the intrinsic knowing quality of mind that is present in every experience, but usually overlooked because attention is captured by the content rather than the container. Mathieu Ricard, a Buddhist monk with a PhD in molecular genetics from the Institut Pasteur, has participated in extensive neuroimaging studies at the University of Wisconsin under Richard Davidson. During compassion meditation, Ricard's brain showed gamma wave activity at amplitudes never before recorded in the neuroscience literature. The left prefrontal cortex, associated with positive emotion, showed activation far beyond the normal range. These are not subtle effects. These are dramatic, measurable changes in brain activity produced by conscious intention trained over decades of contemplative practice. The mind changing the brain, consciousness reshaping its own neural substrate. This is mental causation demonstrated in the laboratory. And it is exactly what the Buddhist tradition predicted. that consciousness trained through specific practices can alter its own expression through the brain. Not because the brain produces consciousness, because consciousness uses the brain and can modify the instrument it uses. The Alaya Vijnana maps onto the quantum information framework with remarkable precision. It is not a thing, but a process. It is not located in a specific place, but is distributed. It carries information patterns that persist through transformations. It is deeper than the individual physical organism. It connects different physical instantiations through informational continuity rather than material identity. Replace Buddhist terminology with quantum terminology, and the description is nearly identical. A continuously flowing quantum information stream carrying patterns that persist through physical transformations, connecting different biological systems through informational continuity. The storehouse consciousness is the quantum information field described in the language of phenomenological investigation rather than mathematics. Islam distinguishes multiple layers of consciousness with a precision that Western philosophy has largely ignored. The Quran uses several terms. Ruh is the spirit, the divine breath that God breathed into Adam. It is not produced by the body. It comes from God directly. It is the animating principle that makes a living being alive and conscious. When the body dies, the Ruh returns to God. This maps directly onto the filter model. The Ruh is consciousness that comes from outside the body. The body receives it, channels it, expresses it. At death, the body returns the Ruh to its source. Nafs is the self, the ego, the desiring, wanting, fearing, hoping personality that you experience as me. The Quran identifies multiple levels of nafs. Nafs al-amara is the commanding self. Driven by desires and impulses, nafs al-lawwama is the self-accusing self, the conscience that recognizes its own failings. Nafs al-mutmainna is the tranquil self, the self at peace, the self that has surrendered to reality as it is. These levels are not static categories, they are stages of development. The nafs can evolve from the lowest to the highest through spiritual practice and divine grace. The Sufi tradition within Islam developed the most sophisticated phenomenology of consciousness in the Islamic world. The Sufis mapped the territory of inner experience with the precision of cartographers. They identified the qalb, the spiritual heart, as the seat of consciousness deeper than the brain, not the physical heart, the spiritual heart, the center of awareness, the organ of perception that perceives not physical reality but spiritual reality, the divine attributes, the hidden dimensions of existence that the physical senses cannot detect. The qalb has its own form of knowing, kashf, unveiling, direct knowledge that does not pass through the senses or through rational inference, knowledge by presence, knowledge by being. You know something not because you have evidence for it, but because you are it. This is structurally identical to what Chalmers calls acquaintance, first-person knowledge that cannot be reduced to third-person description. The Sufis identified the hard problem 1,000 years before Chalmers named it. Ibn Arabi, the great 12th century Sufi philosopher, articulated a framework called Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being. Reality is one. There is only one existence, and that existence is consciousness. What we call the physical world is the self-disclosure of divine consciousness. Matter is not a separate substance from which consciousness must somehow emerge. Matter is a modality of consciousness, a way consciousness appears to itself. The physical world is consciousness looking at itself through the lens of form and multiplicity. The brain is not a machine that produces consciousness. The brain is a pattern within consciousness, a way that the one awareness focuses itself into the experience of being a particular person in a particular body at a particular time. This is structurally identical to Bohm's implicate order. Both propose that consciousness and matter are not separate substances, but different expressions of a single underlying reality. Both propose that the manifest world of distinct objects is a surface appearance beneath which lies a unified field. Both propose that the brain does not produce consciousness, but is a pattern within consciousness. The convergence is extraordinary. A 12th century Sufi mystic and a 20th century quantum physicist arriving at the same structural description of reality through entirely different methods. Ibn Arabi through decades of contemplative practice, Bohm through decades of mathematical physics. Different languages, different methodologies, same conclusion. Reality is one. Consciousness is fundamental. Matter is a manifestation of consciousness, not the other way around. The Hindu tradition converges on the same point through Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual philosophy articulated most famously by Shankara in the 8th century. Brahman is the only reality, pure consciousness, without attributes, without form, without division. What we call the physical world is Maya, not illusion in the sense of being fake. Illusion in the sense of being a partial and misleading appearance of something deeper. The rope mistaken for a snake in the classic analogy. The rope is real, the snake is not fake. It is the rope seen incorrectly. The physical world is Brahman seen through the lens of ignorance. When ignorance is removed, the physical world does not disappear. It is recognized as what it always was, Brahman. Consciousness, the dreamer, waking up within the dream. Now, I must be clear about the limits of these convergences. Structural similarity is not identity. The fact that Buddhist Alaya Vijnana sounds like quantum information does not prove that Buddhist monks discovered quantum mechanics through meditation. The fact that Ibn Arabi's Wahdat al-Wujud sounds like Bohm's implicate order does not prove that Sufi contemplation accesses the same reality that quantum physics describes. The convergences might be coincidental. They might reflect the limited number of ways that consciousness can describe its own nature regardless of whether the descriptions are accurate. They might reflect shared cognitive biases deeply embedded in human cognition, rather than shared truths about external reality. The human mind might have a tendency to produce certain structural descriptions of reality regardless of whether reality actually has that structure. Pattern recognition is the brain's great strength and also its great weakness. We find patterns even where there are none. There is also a selection bias at work. I have highlighted the convergences between quantum mechanics and the contemplative traditions. I have not highlighted the divergences, and there are divergences. Hindu Turiya describes a state of pure consciousness without content. Buddhist Vijnana says consciousness is always consciousness of something. These are contradictory claims. They cannot both be correct in the same sense. Islam insists on a fundamental distinction between creator and creation. Advaita Vedanta insists there is no such distinction. Wahdat al-Wujud is heretical to mainstream Islamic theology. Anatta contradicts Atman. The traditions agree on some structural features and disagree dramatically on others. Cherry-picking the agreements and ignoring the disagreements is intellectually dishonest. The full picture includes both convergence and contradiction. Furthermore, the contemplative traditions are not empirical science in the modern sense. They do not use controlled experiments. They do not employ double-blind methodologies. They do not publish in peer-reviewed journals with statistical analysis. The contemplative data is first-person subjective report refined over centuries through disciplined practice and cross-validated within communities of practitioners. This is valuable data. It is the only data available about the interior of consciousness. But it is not the same kind of data as a measurement from an fMRI or a result from a quantum experiment. Treating first-person reports and third-person measurements as equivalent in evidential weight is a methodological error. But the convergences might also be real. They might reflect the fact that consciousness investigating itself from inside and physics investigating reality from outside are both encountering the same fundamental structure. If consciousness is fundamental to reality as quantum mechanics increasingly suggests, and as every contemplative tradition independently concluded, then two methods of investigating reality should converge on the same descriptions. Not because the methods are the same, because reality is the same. Different maps of the same territory should show the same major features, even if the cartographic conventions differ. Here is the honest accounting of where we stand. We know that consciousness exists, and that it is the most certain fact available to any conscious being. We know that 150 years of neuroscience has not explained how physical processes produce subjective experience. We know that the hard problem is real and has not gotten easier with more data. We know that the brain correlates with consciousness, but the nature of the correlation, whether production or filtering or transmission, remains empirically undetermined. We know that terminal lucidity contradicts the production model's prediction that brain destruction always reduces consciousness. We know that psychedelics can expand consciousness while decreasing brain activity, contradicting the production model's prediction that more consciousness requires more brain activity. We know that quantum mechanics after 100 years cannot remove the observer from the description of physical reality. We know that the measurement problem remains unsolved. We know that the Orch-OR model provides a specific testable framework connecting quantum mechanics to consciousness through microtubule dynamics. We know that quantum biology has confirmed quantum effects in biological systems at physiological temperatures. We know that contemplative traditions across every culture independently concluded that consciousness is fundamental to reality and is not produced by the body. We do not know whether consciousness is produced by the brain or filtered by it or some combination of both. We do not know whether the hard problem will eventually be solved within a materialist framework or whether it requires a fundamental revision of our understanding of reality. We do not know whether Orch-OR is correct in its specific mechanism. We do not know whether the measurement problem will be resolved by giving consciousness a fundamental role or by some other approach. We do not know whether the convergences between contemplative traditions and quantum physics reflect genuine shared truth or coincidental structural similarity. What I believe based on the totality of the evidence is this. I believe the production model is incomplete, not wrong in everything it claims, incomplete. The correlations between brain and consciousness are real. The brain clearly plays a critical role in shaping conscious experience. But the production model cannot account for terminal lucidity, cannot account for psychedelic expansion through decreased brain activity, cannot account for near-death experiences during flat EEG, cannot account for the hard problem, cannot account for the measurement problem. The anomalies are too numerous, too well documented, too structurally coherent to be dismissed. I believe consciousness is more fundamental than the materialist framework allows. Whether it is a property of quantum mechanics, as Penrose suggests, or a fundamental feature of information integration, as Tononi suggests, or a property of the implicate order, as Bohm suggests, or the ground of all being, as the contemplative, traditions suggest I do not know. These are different descriptions that might be describing the same reality from different angles. The physicist sees quantum mathematics. The contemplative sees direct experience. The neuroscientist sees correlates. Each sees a facet of something that might be too fundamental to be captured by any single methodology. I believe the relationship between the brain and consciousness is more like filtering or tuning than production. The evidence points in this direction, not conclusively, not proven, but consistently. Terminal lucidity, psychedelic expansion, the filter model's ability to explain anomalies that the production model cannot. Penfield's own conclusion, after decades of brain stimulation. The persistent failure of the production model to bridge the explanatory gap between neurons and experience. And I believe the convergence between quantum mechanics and the contemplative traditions is significant, not proof. but not coincidence either. When two independent methods of investigation separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles arrive at structurally similar descriptions of the relationship between consciousness and physical reality, the most honest response is to take both seriously. Not to dismiss the physics because it sounds mystical, not to dismiss the traditions because they are not physics, but to hold both and ask what kind of reality could produce both descriptions simultaneously. The answer might be a reality in which consciousness is fundamental, in which the physical world arises from consciousness rather than consciousness arising from the physical world, in which the brain is an instrument that consciousness uses to navigate physical reality rather than a machine that produces consciousness as a byproduct, in which the measurement problem and the hard problem are the same problem because consciousness and physical reality are the same thing, seen from inside and outside respectively. This is not the final answer. This is the beginning of the question, the real question. The question that will define the next century of science. Not how does the brain produce consciousness, but what is consciousness and what is its relationship to the physical world at the most fundamental level. Not how does matter produce mind, but are matter and mind two expressions of something deeper. Not how does the brain generate awareness, but why is there awareness at all, and what role does it play in the constitution of physical reality? The question stands at the intersection of quantum mechanics and neuroscience and philosophy and the contemplative traditions. It cannot be answered by any one of these disciplines alone. It requires all of them. Physics to describe the mathematical structure of reality at the quantum level, neuroscience to map the correlations between brain states and conscious states, philosophy to clarify the concepts and expose hidden assumptions, and the contemplative traditions to provide the first-person data, the data of experience itself, the data that no instrument can measure because it is the thing that all instruments are ultimately designed to serve, the subjective experience of the conscious being who builds the instrument and reads the measurement and asks the question. This is why the investigation of consciousness is unlike any other scientific investigation. In every other field of science, the investigator is separate from the investigated. The physicist studying the electron is not an electron. The biologist studying the cell is not a cell. The astronomer studying the galaxy is not a galaxy. But the consciousness researcher studying consciousness is consciousness. The investigator and the investigated are the same thing. This creates unique challenges. How do you study something that is the precondition for all study? How do you explain something that is the precondition for all explanation? How do you observe the observer? But it also creates a unique opportunity. Unlike any other phenomenon in the universe, consciousness can be investigated from both sides simultaneously. From outside through physics and neuroscience, from inside through contemplative practice and phenomenological investigation. No other phenomenon offers this dual access. And the possibility that the two methods of investigation will converge on the same description is the most exciting prospect in science today. Because convergence would mean that we have finally begun to understand the deepest feature of reality, the feature that makes understanding possible at all, the light by which all else is seen. What is consciousness? Where does it come from? What is its relationship to the physical world? Does it survive the death of the brain? Is it the foundation of reality, or a late arriving decoration on top of reality? Is the measurement problem the same as the hard problem? Is the observer in quantum mechanics the same as the experiencer in neuroscience? Is the wave function collapse the same as the moment of conscious awareness? These are not small questions. These are the largest questions any conscious being has ever asked, larger than any question in physics, because they include physics and transcend it. Larger than any question in neuroscience because they include neuroscience and go beyond it. Larger than any question in philosophy because they are not abstract puzzles to be solved over coffee. They are personal, urgent. They are about you. about the awareness behind your eyes right now, about the light that illuminates your experience in this very moment, about the mystery that you are, the mystery that you have always been, the mystery that every human being who has ever lived has been, a mystery that has stared back at us from every mirror, from every still pool of water, from every quiet moment when the noise of the world falls away and we are left alone with the simple, astonishing fact that we are aware that something exists that knows it exists, that the universe has produced, or perhaps always contained, or perhaps always been a point of view, and inside, a light. After 4,000 years of contemplative investigation, after 150 years of neuroscience, after 100 years of quantum mechanics, after the hard problem and the measurement problem and the Orch-OR model and the filter theory and terminal lucidity and quantum biology and the default mode network and every experiment and every theory and every tradition and every meditation and every equation, we are closer to the answer than we have ever been. The hard problem is clearly formulated. The measurement problem is precisely defined. The quantum biology is confirmed. The contemplative data is being taken seriously by neuroscience for the first time. The filter model has empirical support that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. Orch-OR provides a testable mathematical framework. IIT provides a rigorous formalism. The convergences between physics and contemplation are being documented and analysed, and yet we have never been further from certainty. Because the closer we look at consciousness, the deeper it gets. The more we understand about the brain, the more mysterious the relationship between brain and experience becomes. The more precisely we formulate the hard problem, the more clearly we see that our current conceptual framework cannot solve it. The more rigorously we investigate the measurement problem, the more convinced we become that it requires something we do not yet possess. The investigation continues. In the laboratories and the meditation halls, in the physics departments and the philosophy seminars, in the quantum biology experiments and the neuroimaging studies, in the equations and the silence, in every discipline that touches the question, and in you. In the awareness that is reading these words, in the consciousness that is wondering about its own nature, in the light that is asking where the light comes from. That question is the investigation, and the investigation might be the answer.